So, when you look at this slide, it looks like, I have arrived, I've accomplished a lot, which I have, and I'm very thankful for that. But if you go to the next slide, Titu, that is not how it started for me. My reality was completely different just about, a decade ago. So the next slide, please. This is a little animated. So I started my PhD with, like everybody does, with a very cool hypothesis. And the coolness about my PhD stopped right there. We came up with a very nice hypothesis, and then from that point on, it was just, as they say here, downhill for me. Why was that? We chose an enzyme to go after an enzyme that probably doesn't exist. And so I spent a lot of time in cold rooms and late nights trying to figure out if this enzyme really existed. Multiple failed experiments. My whole dissertation is a book full of, you can do this, but you will not see the result. This cartoon basically sums up how my graduate school days went by. So, and then ultimately mine is the very classic story of PhD success. You do a secret project that your boss doesn't know about, and ends up that is the one that gets you out of jail. That's your get out of jail card, which is, you write that up and then you're able to finish your PhD. I took 6 years for my PhD, and SBT is not a fancy scientific term. It's just sweat, blood, and tears. And ultimately, I have a dissertation to show for that, but if you click again, 0 publications to show for it. Why is this important? I'm trying to show you the contrast between where I am now, but the road that I traversed and the paths that I had to cross to get here. Go to the next slide, please. So, in retrospect, when I think about grad school, right, it prepares you for a lot of things. But let's look at the lighter side of it, right? It prepares you to work for less than minimum wage. You have to put up with, bosses who, have their way of doing it, and you'd have to be in silence. You keep chasing a whole bunch of failed experiments. You get really excited about concepts that only you understand because, your boss might have pumped you up to say that, how cool is this? You're the only one in the world who knows about this. And then you probably will write a grant and maybe a couple of papers, and basically that is what it prepares you for. But the point today of these seminars and what we're talking about is, how do you turn that around? How do you turn that around into working for less than minimum wage, being that you're very self-driven? How do you talk about, dealing with tough bosses and people in the lab as something that drives your patience and your diplomacy, and so on and so forth? In the interest of time, let's just go to the next slide. So this is a traditional career pathway, right? You finish your master's and then you get into a PhD program and postdoc and faculty. So the grad school prepares you for this. And only this, by the way, only recently have some programs started diverging from that and looking at other options that they can bring to their PhD students. Next slide, please. And then you realize that, even in academic research, your intellectual freedom is extremely limited, right? So I'll just throw this here. We'll go to the next slide. Why are we talking about this today, right? Because if you look at this upside down, kind of a parable or this distribution curve, and we all realize that, holy smokes, the time is now. I'm running out of time. My earning potential is being limited. How do I expand that? The problem is this: when you get into grad school, purists of science will tell you that chasing wealth or chasing income is frowned upon, and that is why very often industry is called the dark side. But I'm here to tell you that it doesn't have to be that way. There is extremely high quality research that you do, even on the industry side, and I have an example of that. Let's go to the next slide. So, I truly believe, this slide resonates to me because, for you to do things that are unconventional, that you've not been trained for, and to break out of the bounds that you have, the possibilities are limitless, but it starts by fundamentally reshaping who you are. So this picture resonates with me because there were things that I had to do to be able to get into that mindset. So on the next slide, I will talk to you about some of the options that exist on the industry side, and I'll focus specifically on the ones that would be categorized as medical affairs. And I think this probably applies both for pharma and medical device. So R&D positions continue to be the main place where a lot of PhDs migrate into. That is, doing basic research and for drug delivery, vaccine development, whatever that may be, microbiology, work and QA, QC, and so on. So there are a lot of those that exist anyways. But at the same time, you need to realize that, that the pool of people who would be applying for these jobs is also as big. And so you continue to be in that kind of a competitive space of, competing with all of these other PhDs also. So, but then when you look at functions like medical affairs, for example, there are niches or areas that you could go after where you could establish yourself and separate yourself out from the crowd. Medical and clinical writing is one of the easiest, in my experience, I've noticed that the medical writing part has been one of the easiest pivots to make when you get out of a PhD program or a postdoc program. And the reason for that is because of the training and the learning that you already have in terms of being able to write papers or grants and so on. But it is the art of storytelling. And, if you think about it, all data, even from publications and so on, it is all storytelling. How do you take the data? How do you take complex concepts of science and simplify them into something that people can understand? It could be, and clinical writing could be writing from a marketing standpoint. So it could be clinical marketing. It could be regulatory writing and so on. So that is one of the integral parts of a medical affairs organization. And that is, I would submit, that is probably one of the easiest places where you can pivot when you're making a transition from academia to industry side. Medical science liaison is another area that is also becoming more and more popular these days. In my organization, I have a few medical science liaisons, but because it's a medical device industry that I belong to, we look typically for people who come from a cath lab or from an interventional radiology suite. For microbiologists, biochemists, another easy way to get to medical science would be in the pharma or the biotech industry. I'll also tell you this. I'm talking to you about all of these different career options that exist in the industry, but I'm not going to make you believe that it is, slam dunk, it's straightforward or easy to get into these things. Getting a break into these positions is hard, especially when you're doing a PhD or post-PhD. It can be challenging, but persistence really here is the name of the game. There is this, so my path, when I was doing my PhD, and I realized very quickly that, my dissertation was going to be, 200 pages of failed experiments. I decided to pivot and get into the management side of it. My approach, my thought was always that I would finish my PhD and get an MBA. But instead, during my PhD, I did what is called as a postmaster's in clinical research from Duke University. And it basically is studying, the effects of drugs or devices in healthy human volunteers or sick patients, and getting the data necessary for getting FDA approvals for your products. And that is the path that I chose. Because I did it from a school like Duke University, it gave me just a little bit of an edge because it helped me open up doors and get my first break into the industry. I'll talk to you about it just a little more in a second. Regulatory affairs is another area that you might want to consider. Again, getting a foothold, getting a toe in the door is going to be a little bit of a tricky and a challenge, but once you're in there, regulatory affairs is one of those functions where every year that you spend there, your value keeps increasing exponentially because there are very few regulatory affairs people, and there are a lot of openings for really people who understand it and are seasoned and have the experience. Biostatistics is something that we do as probably one course during graduate studies, and we forget about it unless you pursue a master's in biostatistics. But in this day and age where data, big data, AI, this is the standard in today's world, being able to analyze and make sense of that data is going to be extremely critical and important. As scientists, who have trained and have terminal degrees, it becomes easy for you actually, if you think about it, to pivot and build your expertise in statistics. That would probably mean getting an additional master's or something in statistical science or a SAS certification or something, but explore that possibility. That is, again, one of those fields where the demand is high, supply is low. And then finally, sales or marketing. I've seen people who have, come from the lab, in fact, microbiologists who have pivoted to sales jobs right out of PhD for different companies of, like diagnostics or reagents or microscopy and so on. So, but if I were to sum it up into what makes up medical affairs, it would be the clinical research aspect, biostatistics, medical science liaison, or the clinical medical writing. These functions make up the medical affairs function. What does that mean? It means that you have people in the organization who talk about the data, who are talking about the science with the physicians in the community or with the patients, and are being able to simplify these kind of complex scientific principles that we were talking about. Let's go to the last slide, please. The next one is my last slide. I just want to check the chat window to make sure that that the audio is okay.
Yeah, good.
Okay. So how do you change careers? How, I mean, everybody talks about, well, you need to get out of academia into industry. And I'd like I mentioned in the previous slide, getting that break is going to be hard. It is not straightforward. It takes a few years. It takes some work to be able to do that. I started by getting additional education. While I was doing my PhD, I got a postmaster's in clinical research, like I said, and maybe some of you may have to do that too. It could be a certification in regulatory affairs or clinical research and so on. But whatever you do, make sure that you do it from a place that really matters. So, for example, I'll give you, from my personal experience, I did my program from Duke University, and that opened doors for me immediately as soon as I finished my PhD. I've seen others who have done it from, local state universities or so on, and it really hasn't had the same kind of an effect. So whatever you do in terms of additional education or certification, make sure you do it from a place that carries that brand name and matters. The second point I cannot emphasize enough, and the gentleman who gave the opening comments, Dr. Hawk, also said that networking is important, and I cannot emphasize that, especially if you're planning on making a transition. Network as much as you can, and that means you may have to send LinkedIn emails or messages to people that you've never known or met before, but it's just an email, and that may be the end of the conversation, but it could open a door. I'll give you an example of from my professional growth itself. When I was doing my clinical research work and my PhD, I was at Texas Tech University, and I volunteered myself to go down to the clinical research center at Texas Tech, and I used to do my PhD work in the morning, and in the evening time I used to go and write protocols and go through data from patient records and all of that, and work and contribute for free, do my volunteer work with the clinical research group. I had to do a comparative analysis between academic research and industry research, and so through conversations I got connected to somebody on the industry side, had a phone call, wrote up my report, and so on. Cut to 1 year later, after that, I moved up to Duke Clinical Research Institute. I got a job there, but I knew very quickly that, in a large academic center, I would be a small fish in a big pond, and I wanted to break out of that. So this person that I spoke to over phone like a year or a year and a half ago, out of the blue, I just sent an email and I said, look, I'm in the market and I'm looking for a job. Would you have any? 2 days later, Nagesh, I got an email from this lady.
Dr. Nagesh, we have few more minutes if you can wrap it up. Sorry.
Yep, got it. But my point is that connection that I made on that day has opened up doors for me, and I still work for the same person, and we work together now 15 years later. Communication skills are extremely important, especially for people like us who come from Southeast Asia. This is something we have to work on, and I cannot stress that enough. The creative tension piece that I wrote here is let that paranoia drive you, and the other things that are very straightforward. But by the way, if you click on the slide again here, those. If you think about it, you have learned all of these things in your grad school. The 4 to 6 years that you may have spent in grad school, you would have learned the way to get your additional education, working, networking, and all of that. You just need to frame it in that way. Use those tools to get your break in the industry. So I'm sorry if I ran over time, Dr. Hassan, but I will give the stage back to you.
And I hope that you enjoyed the session, and please, if you do, please join our ISBM Facebook group. And with that, I would like to end the session.